What is stalking? Stalking is unwanted and or repeated surveillance by a group or a person towards another individual. It may involve following that person, monitoring what they're doing, looking at their social media activity, repeatedly communicating with them in some form, either in person, electronically, through the post, on social media, or attempting to do so. Stalking is repeatedly reported in the media and has resulted over the last 20 or 30 years in the consequence of various countries implementing legislation to address the issue. For instance, in the United Kingdom, it resulted in the Protection from Harassment Act, hitting the statute bug. There are, of course, different types of stalking. First of all, you can have what I would regard as the celebrity obsession. And this is probably the one that is given most prominence. So famous instances occur of individuals who have the celebrity stalker. Indeed, it is jokingly referred to as, in some instances, an indicator that you are famous when you get your own stalker. Some famous examples of celebrity stalkers includes Jonathan Whooper and Rihanna, Richard Franco and Hale Berry, Masahiko Chiwaza and Britney Spears, Mark David Chapman and John Lennon, which of course resulted in Lennon's death, Robert Hoskins and Madonna. Celebrity stalkers may well be narcissists, but more often they are actually undertaken by individuals who have a mental disorder such as schizophrenia or delusional disorder. Narcissists can, of course, become involved as a consequence of a sense of entitlement to have some kind of relationship with the celebrity, delusion that they're somehow on a par and merit the attention of the celebrity, the magical thinking that somehow there is a special connection between them and the celebrity. And in those instances, the celebrity obsession might manifest from a narcissist, but more usually it is the occurrence of an individual suffering an alternative form of disorder or mental health issue. Celebrity obsessions actually form a small part of the stalking that does go on, although, of course, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it is the majority of stalking given the prominence that it attracts, but that's, of course, because it sells newspapers, gets clicks on the internet. So the first category of stalking that exists is that which appertains to celebrity obsessions. There is then what we might call professional stalking, and this is where there is surveillance of an individual. It might be personal surveillance. So, for instance, a wife suspects that her husband is having an affair. She hires a private detective to then follow the spouse around to find out what he is up to. Now, it might just be coincidentally that the private detective is a narcissist, but the driving factor for this kind of surveillance is a professional obligation imposed upon that individual to gather information about the target. And the individual is followed about their day, observed by the private detective from a position in his tailing vehicle, as the films depict, hovering outside his workplace, hotels, etc., taking photographs with a long lens camera. There's also state surveillance, of course, whereby the security services will in effect stalk an individual by monitoring them, by following them, less likely to engage in communication with them as they gather intel about the individual, which is then used for appropriate circumstances related to state defence and state security. In these instances, professional stalking is undertaken by relevant actors as a consequence of a professional obligation arising out of a professional transaction, the hiring of a private detective, or state actors operating within the auspices of the framework of the security of a nation. Such activity might be performed by a narcissist, but the driver is a professional obligation. Then we come to the third category of stalking, and this is the largest, and that is narcissistic stalking, also known as hoovering. When it occurs within the sphere of narcissism, stalking is a form of hoovering. Who might be the victim of narcissistic stalking? Former intimate partner, neighbour, friend, colleague, employer, or somebody belonging to an organisation that the narcissist has had an involvement with. Possibly a professional individual, a carer, or somebody providing a pastoral influence, for instance, a vicar. People such as doctors, lawyers. Those are the potential victims of narcissistic stalking. How might that manifest? Well, the most common one, and the one that you'll be familiar with, is as a former intimate partner, the narcissist stalking you by hanging around outside where you live or where you work, by following you around in the car or following you to walk down the road, monitoring your social media, possibly commenting, perhaps bombarding you with texts and emails, trying to talk to you as you walk down the road, turning up at your house, repeatedly trying to engage with you, sometimes in a benign fashion, for instance, bringing gifts, just wanting to talk, in other instances in a more threatening way, threatening damage, shouting, issuing threats to person, committing damage to your property, intimidation. And that is the most common one that people are used to, is where there is this hoovering, narcissistic stalking, of a former intimate partner. But it might, for instance, take place with regard to a neighbour. So one neighbour is a narcissist, one is not. And that individual is engaging in the classic twitching of the net curtains, always having a nosy at what the victim is doing, standing and watching them from their own property, watching from the window, setting up cameras to watch, possibly going round and complaining repeatedly about noise, whether real or imagined, complaining about supposed boundary transgressions, you park your car across my drive, or that your apple tree branches are overhanging my garden slightly. With regard to a friend, it might be similar in the way of a former intimate partner, in terms of repeatedly approaching that person, possibly benign at first and then moving to malign. With regard to an employer or an organisation, this is more likely to be born out of resentment or a grudge or some kind of vengeance, whereby, for instance, a dismissed employee keeps turning up and haranguing the staff on reception, or follows one of the directors, berating them for the loss of their job. Possibly with regard to an organisation, it might be haranguing people that work at the organisation as a consequence of a perceived injustice. With regard to somebody who has supplied a professional service, a therapist, a doctor, a lawyer, sometimes this is in a malign manner if there's been a dissatisfaction or perceived dissatisfaction with the service provided. Sometimes it is done to cause a reaction from that provider because the narcissist does not approve of what the individual is doing. They actually had no professional relationship. So, for instance, it might be that the narcissist harangues a lawyer defending a notorious child rapist, for instance, and the narcissist does not approve of the defense of this individual and therefore continues to harass by stalking the lawyer on a quest to berate them for acting for such a reprehensible human being. Or it might be in the context, for example, an anti-abortionist haranguing a doctor in order to provoke a reaction born out of a desire to punish that individual for the role that they perform. So, there are various victims, and they cover former intimate partner primary source, possibly intimate partner secondary source, or dirty little secret. The narcissist repeatedly hoovers, i.e. narcissistic stalking, by trying to take them off to the shelf where that victim, either IPSS or DLS, has implemented a no-contact regime. It could be non-intimate secondary sources, neighbour, friend, employer, professional, individual. So there are a variety of victims that can find themselves at the end of this narcissistic stalking, which is hoovering. What are the motivators for this behaviour? Well, they all, of course, link to the necessity of the narcissist having to assert control over this individual. So, for example, rejection forms a big basis for narcissistic stalking, i.e. hoovering. If the victim has escaped the narcissist and has embarked upon a divorce against them, the end of the relationship, of course, has caused massive wounding to the narcissist, has affected his control, it's a threat to his control, and therefore, abiding by the first law of narcissism, this individual has to be brought under control. The narcissism dictates that the narcissist must then assert control directly. So they turn up and keep knocking on the door, wanting to talk to the former spouse. It may start off in a benign way. I just want to talk. Can we reconcile? I want to sort things out. We need to talk about the children. But will move to being malign the more the individual rejects the hoovering that is taking place. Of course, remember, it doesn't follow that immediately stalking will occur with this repeated pattern of hoovering. It depends on whether there are hoover triggers and the hoover execution criteria are met, and you must ensure that's kept in mind. But what I'm going to explain to you in these various examples is where there are repeated hoover triggers, and I'll explain why that happens, and the hoover execution criteria is being met, which means that the narcissist keeps hoovering, i.e. engaging in a pattern of narcissistic stalking. Remember, a one-off hoover isn't stalking. Stalking is a pattern of unwanted and or repeated surveillance, interaction, following, monitoring by one individual or sometimes a group towards another. So there has to be a hoover trigger, the hoover execution criteria has to be met, and therefore the hoovering takes place, and it keeps happening, sometimes benign, although unwanted, often malign, certainly unwanted. And that forms the pattern of behaviour which results in the stalking. Accordingly, let's look at some examples and how they come to happen. Rejection, as I was explaining. Former intimate partner primary source escapes the narcissist, cause massive wounding. That amounts to a threat to control. The narcissist has to assert control, therefore goes to talk to the victim, goes to talk to the victim, possibly wanting to resolve matters. The victim receives them, talks, but says, we're not going to get back together again. The fact that there's an ongoing divorce means that there are repeated hoover triggers. A letter from the attorney, a report perhaps from Child Protection Service or CAFCAS, a question from a friend, how are you getting on with the divorce? A reminder to the narcissist because they've had to move into a new property and no longer at the former matrimonial home. A reminder caused by the fact that they drive past the former matrimonial home on their way to work. And all of that, each and every instance, amounts to a reminder of the rejection. Therefore, there are hoover triggers linked to the loss of control, and therefore the narcissist is reminded that because this individual has escaped them, they are not under the control of the narcissist. Therefore, the first law of narcissism applies. The victim has to be brought under control. Therefore, because the hoover execution criteria is being repeatedly met, the narcissist keeps calling round, keeps driving past in a indirect hoover, an indirect physical hoover, or hovers around outside the workplace of the victim or the house. Again, an indirect physical hoover, keeps sending text messages, keeps sending letters, keeps sending emails, direct electronic hoovers, asking other people to go and speak to the victim on their behalf, hoover by proxy. So there are repeated hoovers, direct physical ones, indirect physical ones, hoovers by proxy, and electronic hoovers. And there is a repeated pattern of this because there are frequent hoover triggers, as I have described, and the hoover execution criteria keeps being met. And so the narcissist goes to assert control. And they might actually assert control in that moment, but then they receive another reminder, maybe the next day, that they don't have control because a letter arrives from the lawyers. Therefore, they're forced to assert control over that individual. And this repeated behaviour causes the stalking to occur. And it is all driven by the necessity of the narcissist needing to nullify the threat to their control and gain fuel. It's less about character traits and residual benefits, but that can be relevant. But what's happening with the stalking is it's a repeated pattern of hoovers because the narcissist either attempts to assert control but can't and then has to back off, withdrawal, third assertion of control, or hoovers, gets control, but then moving into a fresh compartment, because remember, we compartmentalize, is reminded that this individual is divorcing them, and therefore the narcissism says, unconsciously, we're lesser mid-range, or consciously, we're greater or ultra, you don't have this person under control. You need to do it. Hoover execution criteria is met, there's another hoover, and on it goes. Repeated stalking behaviour by the repeated hoovering. What about resentment? What if, for example, that the narcissist wants to have a relationship with somebody who is already in a relationship, and they resent the fact that that individual, the object of their maladjusted desire, is with somebody else. There's never been a relationship. Perhaps they are friends, neighbours, or a tertiary source who's vaguely known. But there certainly hasn't been any romantic involvement. The narcissist resents the fact that that person is with somebody else. What does that resentment mean? A threat to the narcissist's control. So, the narcissism says you need to get that person under control. Hoover execution criteria is met, they hoover them. Most likely by trying to seduce them. Be with me, not them. Buying gifts, flattering, complimenting. And of course, all of this may well be unwelcome. And whilst it is seemingly pleasant, it is unwelcome, unwanted, and repeated. And therefore, this narcissistic hoovering of that individual, seductive hoovers, amounts again to narcissistic stalking. What might start off as benign can then turn into malign behaviours when the narcissist's narcissism realises that the benign approach isn't getting anywhere. And they are reminded, perhaps because they live near this person, they drive past their house, it's a friend within a social circle, somebody that they work with, maybe a neighbour. And they see repeatedly this person with another individual. And remember, so long as the Hoover execution criteria are met, sometimes it won't be, and therefore the hoovering doesn't occur, and thus you get no stalking. But where it is being met, for a variety of reasons which are outside of the scope of this video, where that Hoover execution criteria is being met, then the hoovers will keep happening. Why? Again, the narcissist attempts to assert control. The victim accepts the gift, thank you very much. The narcissist feels like he's got control. The next day, he sees that victim again. It's a fresh day, a fresh compartment. Are they under control? We have no information, therefore we assume they're not. And he has to do something else. He perhaps goes over and compliments her. And so it continues. So as long as the Hoover execution criteria are met, and in certain instances this can be done quite readily, the victim is repeatedly hoovered, and it amounts to this narcissistic stalking, born out of the resentment that the individual has because that person is with somebody else. The narcissist wants that person for themselves but can't have them because they're having a relationship with someone else. And that failure to respond positively to their overtures, either at all or by embarking on a formal relationship with them, threatens the narcissist's control, and therefore they are duty-bound to do something to assert that control, either by continuing with seductive hoovers in a benign fashion or shifting to malign ones. Sometimes the stalking is predatory in nature, and these are predatory hoovers which the victim might not actually be aware of because the narcissist isn't physically interacting, but is hoovering by way of observing through an indirect physical hoover what the individual is up to. This requires planning and therefore is only undertaken by greater or ultra, and is done as a precursor to the assertion of control by moving in for a seductive hoover. So, there are two types of predatory planning types of stalking: the planning for seduction and the planning for a malign event. The planning for seduction is basically where the narcissist is gathering information about the target as a conscious step to doing so, to then commencing the actual physical direct hoovering of that individual. And you can read more in the book Sitting Target about how that's done. Lesser and mid-range narcissists can instinctively gather this information as a precursor to seductive stalking, but they're not aware that that is what they are doing. They just gather the information as a consequence of a need to assert control from their perspective in that moment. The other aspect, of course, is where a greater or ultra wants to cause a problem for the individual and therefore stalks them by watching their movements, seeing what time they are at home, what car they drive, where they go and at what time, who they interact with, and so forth, as part of the planning of then executing a malign hoover by way of a particularly unpleasant event against them. So, narcissistic stalking can occur in a predatory way as part of the preparation for a further form of hoovering, whether seductive or malign. In some instances, the precursor to the narcissistic stalking, the hoovering, is a fixation, driven by magical thinking and a sense of entitlement, but ultimately relating to the need to assert control. It might be that the victim has actually been helpful to the narcissist, a therapist, a doctor, a lawyer, a counsellor. So there has been no intimate relationship, no friendship there, but it was born out of a professional obligation between a provider and the narcissist. The narcissist, once the provision of the service is at an end, doesn't let go. They want to continue to express their thanks and gratitude to that provider, and born out of a sense of entitlement, poor boundary recognition, and the need to assert control, they keep hoovering, i.e. narcissistic stalking. So, for example, the narcissist may feel that the lawyer has been very helpful with regard to the acquisition of a company, and therefore he's reminded of how well his company is doing, which puts him in mind of the lawyer, which then causes him to keep contacting the lawyer, inviting him or her out for dinner, sending gifts, and starts off in a seductive way. But it can shift to a malign approach and malign stalking when the subject, the target of the stalking, does not respond in a way which gives the narcissist control. It might be that the relationship is actually ongoing purely in a professional way, but the narcissist, with no boundary recognition and the need to assert control alongside a sense of entitlement, tries to make a professional relationship one which is intimate, or a friendship. They cross boundaries, turning up at, say, their psychologist's house having found out where they lived, sending gifts, flowers, waiting for them outside of their surgery to ask to go for a drink. And that is because they have a repeated reminder of that individual as a consequence of the ongoing professional relationship. But with that acts as a Hoover trigger, the Hoover execution criteria are met, for instance, they know where this person can be found, it's easy enough to approach them, they haven't wounded them by rejecting them previously, they provide them with fuel, it's a green light for the Hoover to take place. But they Hoover them outside of the professional relationship, but by trying to be friendly, even intimate with the individual. So fixation can be a driver with regard to the need to assert control. Finally, there's vengeance. And this doesn't tend to be where the narcissist wants to have any kind of relationship with the victim, but rather is about provoking a reaction, some form of retaliation. So, for instance, take an individual who's lost his job. He wakes up, he's unemployed, he's reminded of his job loss, his control is threatened, the Hoover execution criteria are met because he can easily go to where he used to work, and he turns up haranguing the reception staff to assert control over the business as a whole by lambasting them for sacking him. Or he goes to the house of the director that was involved in the decision to dismiss him, or the manager. He either asserts control over them because they apologise for their behaviour and he backs off, only to wake up the next day, like some kind of twisted Groundhog Day, reminded of the fact that he still doesn't have a job. That threatens his sense of control, meaning that he then has to go and Hoover again. And if the Hoover execution criteria are met, he asserts control over the relevant individual or over the business as a whole by turning up in some form, physically, perhaps indirectly physically, perhaps by an electronic method, less likely by proxy, to assert control over the individual or the business by the narcissistic stalking, i.e. hoovering. I mentioned earlier, for instance, take an anti-abortionist campaigner. They know that a doctor carries out abortions at a particular clinic. There is no personal relationship between them, but born out of their sense of grandiosity, their sense of being perhaps an empath, that they regard the behaviour of the individual as wrong, but they go further, because whilst they're perfectly entitled to form a view as to whether they agree with a person performing abortions or not, the fact is that they transgress personal boundaries by harassing this individual through hoovering, by not recognising the boundary, acting out of a sense of entitlement, acting out of a lack of emotional empathy. They don't want any actual formal relationship with this individual. They don't want to be friends, they don't want to be lovers, but what they want to do is they want to assert control over that individual. So they turn up, because they're able to, the Hoover execution criteria are met, and they behave in a malign method towards that person. If they're frightened by that response, that gives the narcissist control. However, of course, they then learn that this individual is continuing to perform abortions. Threat to that narcissist control, Hoover execution criteria met. So they learn about the fact that the doctor is still carrying out abortions. There's your Hoover trigger. The doctor has come on the radar of that particular narcissist. The Hoover execution criteria are met. The narcissist knows where the doctor's practice is. He can walk there. There isn't a restraining order against him yet. He hasn't been wounded. He has gained fuel. And therefore he turns up and he harangues the doctor again. And either the doctor gives control in some way by the reaction, or ultimately the narcissist breaks off through withdrawal, satisfied that they feel that they've asserted control by frightening this individual and then through their own withdrawal. Narcissistic stalking is hoovering. It is where there are repeated Hoover triggers for a variety of reasons, being reminded of job loss, being reminded that the person who is the object of the desire of the narcissist is with somebody else, being reminded that the spouse has left you because you can see the circumstances of their departure all around you, being reminded of the fact that somebody's carrying out something that you don't agree with, that the narcissist is reminded perhaps of the behaviour of a neighbour because they are literally next door to them. And therefore, there are repeated, possibly daily, even hourly Hoover triggers. And if the Hoover execution criteria are met, the narcissist will then seek to assert control over their victim, whether former intimate partner, secondary source on the shelf that has sought to escape, dirty little secret has sought to escape, non-intimate secondary source, neighbour, friend, employer, professor, doctor, lawyer, architect, therapist, and executes a Hoover against them. Possibly starting off benign, even though such behaviour is unwanted, and then moving to malign, sometimes commencing in a malign environment. So although stalking comes in different forms, primarily celebrity obsession, professional, the largest grouping is narcissistic stalking, i.e. it's hoovering. Hoovering direct physical, indirect physical, electronic, and possibly by proxy. So whether it is following that person home from work, keep knocking on the door wanting to talk to them, smashing their windscreen, hanging around outside their home or their workplace, writing about them in terms of information on the internet, emailing them, texting them, ringing them up. Those are all hoovers and are part of the narcissistic stalking of that individual. Remember, stalking doesn't always happen because the Hoover execution criteria might not be met. And chiefly, this is because the narcissist has moved on to somebody else. So, the former intimate partner is no longer bothered with because they're focused on somebody else and the Hoover execution criteria isn't met. The friend is eventually disengaged from because the narcissist focuses on a different set of friends. The individual who lost his job gets a new job. The individual who engaged with the therapist shifts to a different therapist. So invariably, where there is a replacement for the victim, that usually, though not always, but usually lessens the incidence of hoovering and thus removes the stalking. Of course, the other aspect is where the victim fights back through evoking the law to obtain a conviction against the stalking, hoovering narcissist, whereby there is a restraining order, a non-molestation injunction, or an actual removal to prison as a consequence of the behaviours and perhaps breaching orders ordering the narcissist to stay away. Stalking does come in those three forms. The largest group is narcissistic stalking. It has a range of victims, and the forms in which it takes, the rejected stalker, the resentful stalker, the predatory stalker, the vengeful stalker, and the fixated stalker, are all narcissists when it comes to the narcissistic stalking. And rejection, resentment, predatory, vengeance, and fixation all relate to either the need to assert control or to nullify a threat to control, and to do so through the direct assertion of control. I will in another video deal with the aspect of gang stalking. I'll also deal with another video about fake stalking, where there's delusions of persecution, and also with cyber stalking. But this video is to deal with the question of what is stalking as a whole, and then the focus on how it is actually linked to narcissism a lot of the time, although as usual, many people don't realise that. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.